A Canadian delegation made up of 10 people recently returned from talks in China. On the agenda, everything that's the source of tension between the two nations: Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, China's detention of Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and Chinese bans on certain Canadian exports. One day after the meeting, China removed its ban on Canadian meat imports. Was that connected? And what was said to Chinese officials? Gordon Holden is a former Canadian diplomat to China. He's now the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Professor Holden joins us from Edmonton. Hi there, Professor. Nice to see you again.
It's good to be back on the program. Thank you, Vashi.
Can I ask you sort of how this, just if you could explain to us how it all came about?
Sure. Well, several years ago, when Guy Saint-Jacques was ambassador to China, the China Institute at the University of Alberta, which I had, established a relationship with the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs, which is really a creature of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And we've been holding annual discussions either in China or in Canada since then. This was the fourth round, which the Chinese hosted in a rather remote part of Sichuan province.
So was it unique, though, given the current context?
Well, I think dialogue is always good, but dialogue is especially important when the relationship is not good. And that's certainly the case now. So yes, this one was special given the problems that we are facing between Ottawa and Beijing.
What was the message that you delivered?
Well, the delegation, and I had great fortune to have along a very talented group, a former Minister of Justice, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a former Secretary of State for Finance. And the message, unified message from all of the members was that the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor was a mistake on China's part that had to be rectified. For their part, of course, within this closed meeting, we heard in detail why the Chinese side thinks that the detention of Madame Meng was a mistake and unwarranted on the Canadian side.
Did you learn anything from what they told you with respect to that point that you didn't know before?
There's always going to be something when you meet, not just in formal session for a full day and plus, but also in individual discussions over meals. I don't think there's any magic ingredient that emerged, but I think I can say with confidence that both sides have a better understanding of the other's positions and of the depth of feeling that the respective sides have regarding the detention on our side, the detention of the two Canadians, and for their side, the detention of Madame Meng. I think that had a certain dimension of clearing the air, or at least being able to get that off of our chest. Whether that yields to movement, that may be another issue. But as a former diplomat, I believe in dialogue for dialogue's sake, and that it can eventually sometimes unlock doors. We will see.
Yeah, that was basically what I wanted to ask. Do you think it resonated? And I guess also, to what degree do you think the people you were speaking with were aware of how much of an impact this has had here in Canada?
I think they obviously were well briefed on the issue and had to be, because they knew this was going to be raised. And these are people who are senior foreign ministry officials, former officials, a serving official, and also people from the party. They knew the ins and outs of the issues reasonably well. What I think that particularly the Canadian former ministers brought to the table was the depth of unhappiness in the Canadian public and how this has negatively impacted views of China within this country. Those views have moved sharply negative over the course of almost exactly 1 year, and I think that may have been new to the Chinese side.
And do you think that has the potential to resonate, to have an impact?
I think there's perhaps, and here I'm speculating, there's a realization on the Chinese side that the tactic of the detentions, hostages some might say, hasn't worked, and that it may have been counterproductive. That move, I think, was clearly the genesis of the downward shift in Canadians' view of China that's so remarkably evident in the polls. So at the very least, fortunately, they've stopped that tactic. Whether they can move themselves to release the two detainees in the near future, I don't know. But I think they've clearly understood that this is not worked for them. And I'd like to think that they can creatively find, perhaps in conjunction with the Canadian side, a way out of this box.
I should mention, and you touched on it, but the mix of people in this delegation: former Justice Minister Ellen Rock, former Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird, Ted Menzies, another former minister in Stephen Harper's government, former ambassador to China, former federal deputy ministers. Did that have an impact, do you think, the types of people who were among this delegation?
I think it did. I mean, it was I would think your viewers would agree it was a substantive delegation representing the two principal parties, former very senior deputy ministers and officials. The Chinese basically matched with senior officials on their side, including a party official. Of course, all senior Chinese officials are party officials almost always, but the delegation on their side also reflected ours. They didn't provide us with their list until we had provided them with ours. And I think that added gravitas and weight to what was being said. Again, and we will see. I don't think there's an easy solution to the problems we now face. But again, dialogue has its own benefits. I think there'll be better understanding. And for the Chinese side, I think these decisions on detentions, for example, were taken at a very high level, perhaps the very top. But the Chinese system, and one of the advantages of it, there's a very well-connected system whereby what's heard by senior officials is relayed almost instantaneously to the top levels. So I think that it had merit and perhaps some effect beyond the people sitting opposite us at the table.
That leads me to something I did want to ask you, and that is, you and I have spoken many times on this show since the detainment of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. You remarked, which is actually remarkable, that it's been nearly a year. Do you, or did you leave with any understanding that, an understanding rather, that anything other than the release of Meng Wanzhou will dramatically alter the situation for those two gentlemen?
I wish I could reply in the positive. I mean, the Chinese side was tenacious in highlighting the fate of Madame Meng. And so the answer to that would be no. I don't yet see a mechanism by which the puzzle can be unwound or undone without a change in the status of Madame Meng. I hope that isn't the case. But in narrow answering your question, I didn't see anything at the table to that effect. But we also were, and Mr. Rock was eloquent on this point, we'd like to see an improvement in the conditions of detention of the two Canadians, which stands in stark contrast with the conditions that apply to Madame Meng. That was a point of particular concern. Now, that's not the same as release, but we on the Canadian delegation, I think I can speak for the delegation, would be delighted to see a substantive improvement immedially in the conditions where they're being held, access to fresh air, being in something more closely approaching house arrest rather than the conditions where they are now.
Do you have any, I don't want to read into this, but do you have any optimism that could be the case, that those improvements could be in the near future?
I'm always an optimist at heart, and I am confident that we will see the end of these twin problems. Let me leave it as I am hopeful that will be the case. I think that the Chinese delegation may not have been fully briefed on the specifics of the detention, and perhaps we could see some improvement. That would be a first step, which would be very much welcomed by the families and by Canadians in general. It's not the resolution, but partial steps are always a good thing as a start.
Certainly would be welcome news. Thank you very much, Professor Holden. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Vesely.
Gordon Holden, Director of the University of Alberta's China Institute. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.